How Nigerian politicians destroyed the Naira. Once upon a time, the Naira was a giant. In 1973, when Nigeria replaced the British pound with its own currency, there was pride in every note. 1 Naira could buy more than a US dollar. In fact, Nigerians traveling abroad in the 1970s walked with their heads high. Their currency carried weight. Oil money was pouring in, Lagos was booming, and there was a sense that Nigeria was finally stepping into its destiny as Africa's giant. But behind the glitter, the seeds of destruction were already being planted. The military ruler then, General Yakubu Gowon, stood before the country and launched the new currency with the calm assurance of a man whose nation's pockets were suddenly overflowing. Oil had been discovered in the Niger Delta in the 1950s, but by the 1970s it had become a flood. Money poured into Nigeria's treasury at a pace the country had never seen before. The ports were jammed with goods, imported cars, fridges, TVs, radios. A civil servant could buy a Peugeot with 1 year's salary. University students received allowances so generous they called them boom money, and many didn't think twice before flying abroad for school. Lagos buzzed with foreign companies setting up shop, drawn by the size of the market and the promise of oil wealth. Yet Gowon, guided by CBN Governor Clemente Song, did not build a foundation for the future. The Naira was strong, about $1.50 to 1 Naira, but the strength was wasted. Instead of channeling the oil boom into farms, factories, power stations and railways, Gowon's government splurged. Billions of petrodollars went into white elephant projects, glittering but useless buildings, prestige schemes with no lasting benefit, inflated contracts that enriched cronies. Imports soared, but domestic production stagnated. Gowon famously declared that Nigeria's problem was not money, but how to spend it. That statement captured the fatal flaw: wealth without wisdom. In 1975, Gowon was swept aside in a coup, and General Murtala Mohammed stormed into power with promises of discipline and reform. Nigerians loved him for his no-nonsense style, but his time was cut short by assassination just 7 months later. The reins fell to Olusegun Obasanjo, who carried on from 1976 to 1979. Under his watch, the Naira still held strong, but again, the deeper currents were not in Nigeria's favor. His CBN governor, Ola Vincent, struggled to contain the waste. Oil wealth was still abundant, but corruption had already set in like a virus. By the late 1970s, Nigeria had taken on its first major loans in dollars. At the time, with the Naira strong, it felt harmless. Borrowing $1 billion at 1 Naira 50 to the dollar looked cheap, but those loans would later become chains, because when the Naira weakened, Nigeria would owe far more in real terms than it had received. In 1979, the soldiers handed power back to civilians, and Shehu Shagari was sworn in as president. His arrival was greeted with hope: the Second Republic, democracy reborn. But Shagari inherited a nation drunk on oil, and rather than sober it up, he kept the party going. His Central Bank of Nigeria governor, Adamu Tiroma, presided over an economy drowning in imports. The government borrowed heavily abroad, piling up debts in dollars to fund infrastructure, consumption, and prestige projects. Nigeria was building refineries, steel complexes, and massive housing schemes. But corruption hollowed them out before they could take root. Then the storm came. In the early 1980s, global oil prices collapsed. From over $35 a barrel, crude oil plummeted to under $10. Nigeria's lifeline was cut. Suddenly, the government could no longer pay its bills. The foreign debts Shagari had taken became millstones. What had been borrowed at a time when 1 Naira could buy more than $1 now had to be repaid when the Naira was weakening. Worse, the oil money that had once covered Nigeria's reckless spending was gone. Nigeria was trapped, oil revenue down, debt payments up. By 1983, the Naira had slipped to around 1 Naira and 75 kobo to the dollar. It was a crushing humiliation. Students who once paid tuition in the UK and US with ease suddenly found it expensive. Traders who imported goods from London and Dubai saw profits vanish. The middle class, once comfortable, began to struggle. Shagari's government was also riddled with corruption. Ministers and officials were accused of looting billions, while ordinary Nigerians queued for essentials like rice and sugar. Anger grew, and in December 1983, the military struck again. Major General Muhammadu Buhari seized power, promising to clean the mess with discipline and austerity. Buhari came with fire and brimstone. He jailed corrupt politicians, whipped civil servants into line, and introduced the war against indiscipline. His Central Bank of Nigeria governor, Abdul Qadir Ahmed, faced an impossible task. The Naira was officially pegged at around 2 Naira to the dollar. Buhari chose to fight by rationing foreign exchange. Import licenses were introduced, meaning only those with government connections could access dollars at the official rate. For the masses, the black market was the only option, and on the black market, the dollar fetched far more. It was the beginning of a dangerous dual reality, an official Nigeria where the Naira looked stable, and a real Nigeria where it was collapsing. Buhari also introduced strict import bans, forbidding many items Nigerians had become used to buying abroad. Traders couldn't import goods, shops emptied, and ordinary Nigerians queued for basics. The official exchange rate might have been 2 Naira, but in the markets and the streets, the Naira was losing face daily. Still, Buhari resisted the demands of the International Monetary Fund. By this time, Nigeria's debts had mounted, and the IMF was offering a bailout, but with conditions. Devalue the Naira, they said. Remove subsidies. Privatize state assets. Buhari, stern and unbending, refused. He knew Nigerians would not forgive a leader who openly destroyed their currency, but his refusal meant Nigeria had no relief from its debt burden. By 1985, the economy was suffocating. Poverty deepened, unemployment grew, and Nigerians who had once lived with pride now struggled to survive. And then, in August 1985, Buhari was toppled in a palace coup by General Ibrahim Babangida. Babangida arrived with a smile, promising a human face to reform. Nigerians cheered at first. Weary of Buhari's whip, they welcomed a gentler hand. But it was Babangida who would finally open the door to the IMF, and it was under him that the Naira's real downfall began. When Ibrahim Babangida took power in 1985, many Nigerians sighed with relief. Babangida arrived smiling, promising democracy in the future, and more importantly, promising reforms that would ease the suffering of ordinary people. He called it the structural adjustment Nigeria needed. But in truth, what he brought was the IMF's bitter medicine. By 1985, Nigeria's debts had ballooned. Billions of dollars borrowed under Shagari now needed repayment, but oil prices were still depressed and the treasury was dry. The IMF and World Bank stepped in with an offer: loans, rescheduling, and relief, but on one condition. Nigeria had to accept the Structural Adjustment Program, SAP. It was sold as the cure for Nigeria's economic disease, but it turned out to be poison. The program demanded that Nigeria devalue its currency to reflect market realities. For years, the Naira had been propped up artificially by the central bank, giving Nigerians the illusion that their money was still strong. At the start of Babangida's rule, the Naira stood at about 4 Naira to $1. By 1986, Babangida and his Central Bank of Nigeria governor, Abdul Qadir Ahmed, let go of the peg. The Naira tumbled, first to 9 Naira, then to 12 Naira, and by the early 1990s, it collapsed to 22 Naira to the dollar. Devaluation hit like a thunderclap. Overnight, imported goods tripled in price. A businessman who used to buy $10,000 worth of goods with 40,000 Naira now needed 220,000 Naira for the same transaction. Parents who had been sending children abroad for school suddenly found tuition impossible. A family that once bought a Peugeot car with relative ease now struggled to pay for basic spare parts. Nigerians who traveled abroad were humiliated when their once proud currency was treated like paper. But the IMF's conditions didn't stop there. Subsidies on food, fuel, and essential goods were cut. Prices soared. Civil servants who earned in Naira could no longer feed their families. Traders who relied on imports went bankrupt. Farmers were promised a new dawn as imports became more expensive and local production was supposed to thrive. But without real investment in infrastructure, agriculture collapsed too. Worse still, privatization of state-owned enterprises began. Companies built with public money were sold off at giveaway prices to Babangida's friends and cronies. The political elite, who had access to cheap official dollars through the central bank's allocation system, became millionaires overnight. Ordinary Nigerians, forced to buy dollars at the parallel market rate, were ruined. It was two economies in one country, one for the powerful, another for everyone else. Factories closed in droves. Before SAP, Nigeria had a budding textile industry in Kano, Kaduna, and Aba. Cheap imported fabrics now flooded the markets, while local factories couldn't afford to buy raw materials at the new dollar rates. Over 1 million jobs vanished in the textile sector alone. Manufacturing shrank. Small businesses folded. The middle class, once the pride of the 1970s oil boom, was wiped out. By 1993, when Babangida finally stepped aside after annulled elections and endless political maneuvering, the Naira was a shadow of itself. From 4 Naira to $1 at the start of his rule, it now traded at around 22 Naira to $1. In the black market, it was even worse. The currency that had once been stronger than the dollar was now worth less than a pack of foreign chewing gum. And Babangida himself? He left office one of the richest men in Africa, having overseen the biggest transfer of public wealth into private pockets Nigeria had ever seen. Then came the dark years of General Sani Abacha. From 1993 to 1998, he ruled with an iron fist. His CBN governor, Paul Ogwuma, pegged the official exchange rate around 22 Naira to the dollar, trying to create an illusion of stability. But everyone knew the truth. The parallel market was soaring, sometimes 80 Naira or more to the dollar. And in those days, if you were not part of the inner circle, you had no chance of accessing dollars at the official rate. Abacha institutionalized what Babangida had started. Forex became a weapon of patronage. Politicians, generals, and businessmen close to the regime bought dollars at the official rate, then resold them in the black market for obscene profits. It was called round tripping, and it became one of the fastest ways to get rich. Meanwhile, the common Nigerian had to pay 3 or 4 times more to access the same currency. Abacha himself looted billions. Through secret accounts and shady deals, he siphoned an estimated $5 billion out of Nigeria's coffers. Much of it was kept in dollars abroad, never in the Naira he presided over. While ordinary Nigerians queued for kerosene and food, Abacha's family and cronies built mansions in Europe. The hospitals crumbled, roads turned to death traps, and universities went on endless strikes as lecturers demanded better pay. Yet in Abuja, convoys of bulletproof cars rolled by, fueled by cheap dollars stolen from the treasury. The human cost of these years was staggering. A loaf of bread that once cost a few kobo in the 1970s now cost 30 naira. Transport fares multiplied. Parents who once sent 4 children to university abroad could now barely afford to keep one in a local school. Inflation ate through salaries before they were even paid. Millions slipped into poverty. By the time Abacha died suddenly in 1998, the Naira was broken, and so were the people. The official rate was still painted as 22 Naira to $1, but in the real market, it was far weaker, closer to 85 Naira. For Nigerians, the currency was now an object of mockery. Once the pride of Africa, now a battered paper no one trusted. When democracy returned in 1999 with Olusegun Obasanjo, hope flickered again. But the damage Babangida and Abacha had done was so deep it could not be undone overnight. What had gone wrong was not a mystery. It was not just oil prices or global markets. It was leadership, leaders who borrowed recklessly, leaders who sold the nation's assets, leaders who pegged and devalued and looted, while the people bore the pain. When democracy finally returned in 1999, with Olusegun Obasanjo sworn in as president, Nigerians carried fresh hope on their shoulders. After nearly 2 decades of military dictatorship, perhaps a civilian government could repair the wreckage. The Naira at that point was already limping badly, hovering around 85 Naira to the dollar on the official rate and even weaker on the streets. Obasanjo, who had ruled as a military leader in the late 1970s when the Naira was still a source of pride, now returned to power to find it unrecognizable, a ghost of the currency he once knew. His central bank governor, Joseph Sanusi, had the unenviable task of managing the battered Naira in Obasanjo's first term. Inflation was biting, debt servicing was swallowing over 40% of government revenue, and the country was still under the weight of more than $30 billion in foreign debt, most of it borrowed in the 1980s during the SAP years. To stabilize the economy, Obasanjo had no choice but to dance to the IMF and World Bank's tune once again. Liberalization, deregulation, and more privatization became the order of the day. In 2004, Obasanjo appointed a new CBN governor, Charles Chukwuma Soludo, a man with energy, vision, and boldness. Soludo launched sweeping banking reforms, consolidating Nigeria's fragmented banking sector by raising capital requirements. His mantra was, "Bigger is safer," and he forced mergers that reduced the number of banks from 89 to just 25 strong institutions. On the surface, it worked. Nigerian banks suddenly looked global, opening branches in London, Johannesburg, and Accra. For a brief moment, it seemed the Naira had found a defender who could steady its collapse. But even Soludo's brilliance could not stop the fundamental problem: Nigeria's addiction to oil and its addiction to imports. Every dollar Nigeria earned was spent importing goods it could have produced locally: rice, sugar, clothing, even refined petroleum. Each import was a fresh demand for dollars, and each demand for dollars was more pressure on the Naira. In 2005, Obasanjo struck what many hailed as his greatest achievement. After long negotiations, Nigeria secured debt relief from the Paris Club of Creditors. The country paid $12 billion up front, and in exchange, $18 billion of its external debt was wiped out. It was supposed to be a new dawn. No more suffocating debt service. No more endless borrowing. Nigerians cheered as Obasanjo announced that the chains of debt had been broken. But the celebration masked a cruel irony. The relief came at a time when oil prices were surging. Instead of saving excess oil revenue for a rainy day, Nigeria doubled down on spending. Billions poured into new projects, many of which were abandoned halfway. Billions more disappeared into private pockets through inflated contracts and outright theft. The Naira, meanwhile, kept sliding. When Obasanjo entered in 1999, the rate was about 85 Naira to $1. By the time he left in 2007, it was around 128 Naira to $1 officially, and higher on the parallel market. Then came Umaru Musa Yar'Adua in 2007, a quiet, mild-mannered man who promised a 7-point agenda to transform Nigeria. His CBN governor, Chukwuma Soludo, remained until 2009 when Sanusi Lamido Sanusi took over. Yar'Adua inherited not just the Naira's weakness, but also an economy built on sand. Yar'Adua tried to tackle the Niger Delta militancy that was crippling oil production. Attacks on pipelines and kidnappings of oil workers had reduced output significantly. The amnesty program he introduced in 2009 temporarily calmed the region and boosted production. But by then, another storm was already brewing. The global financial crisis of 2008 sent shock waves across the world. Oil prices, which had hit a record high of $147 per barrel in July 2008, suddenly collapsed to below $40 by the end of the year. Nigeria's reserves shrank, government revenue evaporated, and once again, the Naira bore the brunt. The official exchange rate shifted to 150 Naira by 2009. Sanusi Lamido Sanusi, Yar'Adua's newly appointed CBN governor in 2009, moved quickly. He bailed out banks that had been reckless with loans during the boom years, sacking powerful bank chiefs in dramatic fashion. For a time, Nigerians hailed him as a fearless reformer, the man who exposed the rot in the banking system. But even Sanusi's boldness couldn't shield the Naira from the forces battering it. By the time Yar'Adua's ill health consumed him, and he died in office in 2010, the Naira was wounded, crawling at around 150 Naira to $1. Goodluck Jonathan, his deputy, stepped into power amid both sympathy and suspicion. Nigerians wanted stability after Yar'Adua's long absence, and Jonathan promised transformation. Oil prices recovered, government revenue swelled, and for a brief window, Nigeria experienced impressive GDP growth. In 2014, Nigeria was even declared the largest economy in Africa after a rebasing exercise. The headlines were triumphant, but under the surface, the Naira was unraveling. Jonathan's years were marked by massive oil theft and unprecedented corruption. Billions of dollars in oil revenue simply disappeared. The Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC, became a byword for opacity and looting. In 2012, former CBN Governor Sanusi, now Emir of Kano, would allege that $20 billion in oil revenue was missing under Jonathan's watch. Instead of investigating, Jonathan removed him. The signal was clear: the Naira's health was less important than political survival. By 2014, oil prices crashed again, this time from over $100 per barrel to under $50 within months. Nigeria had squandered the boom years, saving little, and now had no cushion to fall back on. The Naira plunged. It had slid to 197 Naira by the time Jonathan left office in 2015. On the streets, it traded even higher, with the parallel market often diverging sharply from the official rate. The middle class that had started to rebuild under Obasanjo was shrinking again, and inflation was eroding purchasing power daily. And yet, even as ordinary Nigerians watched their currency wither, the politicians and their allies flourished. Their wealth was stored not in Naira, but in dollars, pounds, and euros abroad. They bought mansions in London, sent their children to schools in America, and flew to Dubai for medical treatment. By the time Jonathan left office, the story was clear. From 1999 to 2015, democracy had not delivered salvation. When Muhammadu Buhari returned to power in 2015 as a civilian president, 3 decades after his short-lived military regime, Nigerians were desperate for change. The Jonathan years had ended in a cloud of scandals and economic mismanagement. The Naira stood at about 197 Naira to $1 officially, but on the streets it was already edging above 220 Naira. Buhari had campaigned on promises of integrity, discipline, and a war against corruption. People believed he could do for the Naira what he once tried to do for the nation in the 1980s with his strict military decree-style governance. But the Buhari who walked into Aso Rock in 2015 was not the same steely general of 1984. He inherited an economy on the brink. Oil prices had crashed again, from above $100 per barrel in 2014 to below $50 in 2015. The Naira, already fragile, was exposed to every gust of global wind. Instead of confronting the problem with creativity, Buhari and his central bank governor, Godwin Emefiele, doubled down on controls and distortions. Emefiele became one of the most powerful figures in Nigeria under Buhari, wielding enormous influence over the economy. Together, they created one of the most bizarre monetary systems in the world. Multiple exchange rates were introduced. On paper, the official rate hovered around 197 to 305 Naira for years. But ordinary Nigerians and businesses could not access dollars at that rate. Instead, they were forced to turn to the parallel market, where the dollar quickly crossed 500 Naira, then 600 Naira. For the elite, however, things were different. Politicians, cronies, and those with connections at the CBN could buy dollars at the cheap official rate and then sell them at the black market rate, pocketing billions. For importers and small businesses, it was a death sentence. Manufacturers couldn't get dollars to import raw materials. Students abroad struggled as their parents couldn't source forex to pay tuition. Airlines threatened to stop flying into Nigeria because they couldn't repatriate their earnings. The first recession in 25 years hit Nigeria in 2016, driven by low oil prices and the government's disastrous monetary policies. GDP shrank, inflation soared, and the Naira collapsed. By the time Buhari's first term was ending in 2019, the official rate was around 360 Naira, while the parallel market traded at 450 to 500 Naira. The once proud currency had lost nearly 70% of its value in just 4 years. Yet Buhari was re-elected, as many Nigerians still clung to hope, but the second term only deepened the rot. Instead of reforming, the government printed money recklessly. Ways and means borrowing, essentially overdrafts from the central bank to the federal government, ballooned into trillions. By 2023, over 23 trillion Naira had been advanced by Emefiele's CBN to Buhari's government, much of it unaccounted for. Each fresh injection of unbacked Naira only eroded the currency further, stoking inflation and reducing the purchasing power of ordinary Nigerians. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 was another hammer blow. Oil demand crashed globally, prices briefly went negative in April 2020, and Nigeria's economy spiraled. Remittances from the diaspora, one of Nigeria's key forex inflows, also dipped as Nigerians abroad struggled. The Naira collapsed further, with the parallel market climbing past 500 Naira. Inflation crossed double digits, food prices soared, and poverty deepened. Meanwhile, corruption flourished in new forms. Billions meant for COVID relief were siphoned. Forex round-tripping became a racket. The Naira was deliberately weakened to benefit those who had access to official dollars. Buhari himself seemed aloof, barely addressing the currency crisis, while Emefiele tightened his grip on the forex market. When oil prices recovered after 2021, Nigeria gained little because production was crippled by theft, pipeline vandalism, and mismanagement. Dollars that should have boosted reserves never arrived, and the Naira continued its free fall. By the time Buhari's 8 years ended in 2023, the official rate was around 460 Naira to $1. But on the streets, Nigerians were buying dollars at 750 to 800 Naira. The Naira had been broken. The people were poorer. The middle class had been hollowed out, and businesses had either shut down or fled the country. What should have been a rescue mission turned into a total collapse. When Bola Tinubu was sworn in on May 29, 2023, he knew he had inherited a currency on life support. He came with bold promises. The Naira would be freed, the subsidies that drained government finances would be scrapped, and market forces would finally prevail. For a moment, Nigerians dared to believe that perhaps, finally, a leader was ready to face reality. Within weeks, Tinubu announced the removal of fuel subsidies, instantly doubling and then tripling the price of petrol. The same day, he floated the Naira, merging the official and parallel rates. The move was hailed by economists and international investors as bold and necessary. But for ordinary Nigerians, the pain was immediate and brutal. Without reserves, without strong local production, and without trust, the Naira didn't float, it sank. From around 750 Naira in May, it crashed to 1,000 Naira, then 1,200 Naira, then climaxed to 1,600 Naira by early 2024. Inflation exploded. Food prices went out of control. Bread that cost 200 Naira just a few years before was now selling for 1,500 Naira. Transportation costs multiplied. Rent skyrocketed. Parents who once juggled to pay school fees found it impossible. For millions, life became survival. Multinationals started exiting Nigeria in droves. GSK shut down its operations. Michelin packed up. ShopRite scaled down. The reason was simple. The cost of doing business was unbearable. Forex was impossible to source, and the consumer base was too impoverished to sustain demand. Small businesses collapsed daily, unable to restock as imports became unaffordable. Meanwhile, the political class insulated themselves from the suffering. Lawmakers debated increasing their already bloated salaries. Convoys of bulletproof SUVs choked the streets of Abuja and Lagos. Governors flew private jets to Europe for holidays, while their states owed salaries. Politicians kept their savings in dollars abroad, while preaching patriotism at home. Tinubu's CBN governor, Yemi Cardoso, inherited not just a weak Naira, but also the shadow of Godwin Emefiele's disastrous reign. Emefiele himself was suspended in 2023, arrested amid allegations of multi-billion-dollar forex fraud, shady transactions, and reckless money printing. It was the clearest proof yet that Nigeria's currency had been looted by those entrusted to protect it. But by then, the damage was already catastrophic. The Naira's collapse was not just numbers on a chart. It was the sight of airports packed with Nigerians fleeing under the Japa wave. Doctors, nurses, engineers, and students carrying suitcases, not for holidays but for survival. It was the sight of market women in tears because they could no longer afford a bag of rice. It was the silence of shuttered shops, the despair of unemployed youth, the humiliation of a people who once had the strongest currency in Africa, reduced to beggars in the global market. By 2025, the Naira's story was a tragedy complete. From 1 Naira to $1 in the 1970s, it had fallen to over 1,500 Naira, to $1 within 50 years. Every government had inherited a weaker Naira and left it weaker still. From Gowon's oil boom to Buhari's forex racket, from Babangida's SAP to Tinubu's float, the pattern was the same: mismanagement, corruption, and betrayal. The politicians had destroyed the Naira, and in doing so, they had destroyed the hope of millions. And yet, even in the ruins, Nigerians clung to resilience. They trekked to work when buses became unaffordable. They found ways to stretch meager salaries. They built side hustles, leaned on family, and prayed for miracles. The politicians might have feasted on the Naira's corpse, but the people endured. Perhaps one day, history will tell not just of how Nigerian politicians destroyed the Naira, but how Nigerians, against all odds, rebuilt it. The breaking point in Nigeria's relationship with its currency can be traced to a single fateful decision in the mid-1980s. The embrace of the International Monetary Fund's Structural Adjustment Program. For years before, the Naira had been sliding, but what happened in 1986 was not just a slip. It was a controlled demolition. General Ibrahim Babangida, who had overthrown Buhari in 1985, stood before the nation and presented SAP as medicine. Nigeria was drowning in debt, he argued. Nigeria was trapped in what economists call the original sin of developing nations, borrowing in a foreign currency while earning in a volatile local one. Picture it. In the late 1970s, when 1 Naira was still worth more than $1, Nigeria borrowed millions of dollars for ambitious projects. New refineries, steel plants, highways, even the grandiose Ajaokuta steel complex that never worked. At the time, it looked manageable. After all, the Naira was strong, and oil money was flooding in. But when oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, the country's dollar income shrank dramatically. At the same time, the Naira crashed, meaning every dollar owed abroad now required far more Naira at home to repay. What had once been a tolerable debt burden became a mountain of impossibility. It was in this trap that Babangida turned to the IMF. The negotiations were long and tense. Nigerian economists and politicians debated fiercely. Should the country swallow the bitter pill? The IMF demanded devaluation of the Naira, removal of subsidies, liberalization of trade, privatization of state enterprises. The idea was simple: let the market decide, reduce government interference, and Nigeria would grow stronger. But to ordinary Nigerians, it sounded like a death sentence. And they were right. When Babangida finally accepted SAP in 1986, the Naira was officially devalued from about 2 Naira to nearly 4 Naira to the dollar. That may sound small today, but for a currency that had once been stronger than the dollar, it was humiliation. Overnight, the savings of middle-class families evaporated. Parents who had once sent children to British and American universities now found tuition bills impossible. Traders who imported goods saw their profits wiped out. Factories, unable to import spare parts and raw materials, closed their gates one after another. The SAP years were brutal. Nigerians remember them with bitterness. Subsidies on essentials were removed, meaning fuel, food, and transport costs shot up. Civil servants watched their wages shrink in real terms. Students protested as school fees rose. Workers went on strike. For the first time, millions who had once felt secure slipped into poverty. It was the decade when the phrase, "man must survive," entered the Nigerian lexicon, a shorthand for hustling by any means necessary, because the state had abandoned its people. And while the masses suffered, the elite flourished. Those with access to dollars made fortunes. A new class of businessmen emerged: forex traders, round-trippers, import magnates, who thrived in the chaos. Politicians who had looted during the oil boom now converted their wealth into foreign currencies and banked it abroad, watching from a safe distance as the Naira sank further. The pattern repeated itself in later decades. In the 1990s, under Abacha, the Naira was pegged artificially low, creating two economies: the official rate for the powerful and the black market for ordinary Nigerians. A businessman with the right connections could walk into the CBN, buy $1 million at 22 Naira to the dollar, and sell it for 80 Naira in the parallel market. It was free money, money stolen not from a vault, but from the future of the Nigerian people. By the time democracy returned in 1999, the Naira had already collapsed beyond recognition. The debt trap remained central. Each administration borrowed in dollars when oil prices were high, only to find themselves cornered when oil inevitably crashed. Obasanjo's debt relief in 2005 was supposed to free Nigeria, but instead it opened the door for another cycle of reckless borrowing. Jonathan's government, flush with oil money in the early 2000s, went on a spending spree, burning through reserves and borrowing more. When oil collapsed again in 2014, Nigeria was naked, and the Naira took another fall. Under Buhari, the trap tightened further. The government borrowed massively in both Naira and dollars, with little to show for it. Trillions in Naira were printed under the guise of ways and means, eroding the value of the currency further. At the same time, external debt climbed again to over $40 billion. The human cost mounted. In the 1980s, it was students forced to abandon studies abroad. In the 1990s, it was families skipping meals as inflation soared. In the 2000s, it was civil servants watching their salaries turn to dust by payday. In the 2010s, it was small businesses dying for lack of forex. In the 2020s, it became the Japa wave. An entire generation of young Nigerians packing their bags, convinced that the Naira would never again give them a future. Every crash of the Naira tells a story of betrayal. It is the story of leaders who borrowed recklessly, stole shamelessly, and printed money thoughtlessly. It is the story of IMF negotiators who demanded reforms without caring for the social cost. It is the story of a political class that saved its wealth in dollars while urging citizens to defend the Naira. It is the story of 50 years in which every president and every central bank governor left the currency weaker than they found it. And so, from 1 Naira to $1 in the 1970s, to over 1,500 Naira to $1 in 2025, the Naira's decline is not a mystery. It is a ledger of corruption, incompetence, and missed opportunities. It is the story of a nation that had everything: oil, people, land, potential, but squandered it all. Yet, even in this tragedy, one truth remains. Currencies are not just numbers. They are reflections of trust, governance, and discipline. If Nigeria ever finds leaders willing to break the cycle, to diversify the economy, to punish corruption, to invest oil wealth wisely, the Naira can rise again. History will not always say, how Nigerian politicians destroyed the Naira. One day, perhaps, it will say how Nigerians rebuilt it. Did this video make you smarter? Hit that like button, smash subscribe, and let's keep the good vibes rolling with more videos like this. Brought to you by moneyrate.com, the best place to compare Naira to dollar rates across platforms. Thanks for watching. You're the hero we didn't know we needed, or at least the one who subscribes.